Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of the War Report. We're joined by a couple of special guests. Now, this has been one of those cans that's been kicked down the road for quite some time, but we've actually managed to put this together. Thank you to GSP in particular, since he was the one who really orchestrated this effort. And here we are. We're with the gentleman from World War Now, and I'm sure that our audience probably have a pretty large overlap at this point. So, welcome back, most of you. Welcome to any newcomers, and hopefully you get something out of this these next couple hours here, because we're just gonna kind of go over everything. Of course, there will be news updates, but just because it's their first time on the show, I'm just going to kind of give them the floor for most of it, let them really lay out who they are, what they do, what they think, how they think, etc., etc. You know, the usual. But without further ado, if you guys would like to introduce yourselves, then the floor is all yours.
I guess I'll go first. I'm Conrad Franz. I'm the resident face docs, face expert of the World War Now team. I guess we've been doing a show now for about a year. I'm just a good old American, good old American Anglo-German guy. I'm a convert to Orthodox Christianity. I've been interested in politics. I was born in the D.C. area, so since day one, I've been enmeshed in the terrible world of politics in this dying empire, I guess
You
that
have
I
my full
call my home.
sympathies.
But about but a about almost exactly a year ago now, called up my good friend Dimitri here, who we had some mutual connections over some Orthodox Christian online friends. People may know David Erhan. He was kind of our mutual connection, and hit him up and was like, "Yo, let's start talking about this because I think we're in the middle of World War III." Because one of the things we talk about on our show is a lot of the prophecies of Orthodox saints like Saint Paisios, Saint Seraphim of Aritsa, Saint Lawrence of Chernigov, Saint Cosmas of Aetolia, and Dmitry was like, "I completely agree. We should start a show." And so, next thing you know, we started World War Now. We're on Substack, worldwarnow.substack.com. We're on YouTube as well, and I've been a fan of the War Report since a little bit before I started World War Now. So I've been a few months. I've been listening since the Ukraine war started. I had found some of the content, so I've been a big fan for over a year. So thanks for having me on.
Oh well,
Well,
it's
we're really glad to have you on.
indeed,
I
and
discovered you guys last year, and I thought you guys were one of the best shows I've ever heard. So I've been a follower ever since. And yeah, and I always recommend you guys in my um, whatever Telegram chats I'm in, particularly the Orthodox chats. So
No,
we're very
those are
pleased
really
to have
kind
you.
words. That's very humbling, GSP, and thank you, Konstantin, as well, for having us on the show.
oh, of
My name is
course.
Dmitry Kalyagin. I had I guess, the privilege of being born and raised in a Russian Orthodox family, sort of. So essentially, I am the cradle dox. Never really had a conversion moment in my life, but my entire life was almost, you can say, a long, prolonged catechism of sorts. And this included, of course, political catechism, because once you, I suppose, are involved in the church and you're looking at icons, attending the liturgy, right, since your childhood, you do learn, I guess you are fed, essentially spoon-fed from your early years, but a sort of culture, this conservative Christian culture, which we always talk about. People speak about Christian nationalism and monarchism and things like that, but at one point around maybe 16, 17 years of age, I realized just how disconnected the Western world was, or even the Second World, for example, in maybe like Russia and Ukraine, for example, where I had the privilege of living for a time, and it became apparent to me that the modern world was not built on these. At least it wasn't in at the moment set in these foundations which we learn about in the liturgy, in the church, in the Orthodox tradition. And my exploration began going back into history, finding out where it all went wrong, and that's where I went down the rabbit hole. And everything, it's about maybe 12 years of research later. Here we are, and obtain all of this knowledge. It's really hard to kind of keep it in. So, of course, I started posting on Twitter for a while, and that's kind of where I gained prominence, thanks to some of my good friends, David Erhan, Jay Dyer, and the other good friend, of course. He's no longer really on Twitter in an official way, but there's a man named Snek. He's a French Orthodox
Oh, I know.
seminarian. Yep. So he's actually the guy who helped me I guess, create my Twitter channel, which at the moment it's, I guess, one of the larger Orthodox Christian channels. Even though I never really planned it to be like that, I always planned my Twitter to really be a place where I could post my own personal opinions. But it essentially grew kind of out of proportion after the beginning of the SMO because, well, some of the research I've done for over more than a decade has aligned exactly with how how reality is being played out. Essentially post SMO, and me and Conrad meeting and cooperating has been very natural and organic. I think there hasn't been. I don't think we've had any difficulty besides probably difference in time zones and difference in we both essentially. I think Conrad, you're on the new calendar. Is that right?
Yeah, Antioch
Mm.
gang, but I've got Russian tendencies.
Yeah, so essentially, despite even being on a different calendar in the church, we've still managed to align our time frames and how we do things, and essentially get World War Now off the road. And as you probably understand, GSP and Constantine, the hardest thing is getting started. And right now, at the beginning of October, essentially at the end of September, you could say it's been 1 year since we started, and it's been a good journey. And we have so much more to talk about. Frankly, there are so many subjects which we still haven't really touched on, and we're glad to be here. Maybe we can speak about some of these topics here, and so many. I mean, there's still so much we can share, I think, and obviously there's the news factor too, because the news is constantly evolving, and just having a weekly show where we could update some of our listeners, update ourselves even while doing the research, it gives us a sort of planned trajectory for the future. So it's looking really bright and positive, I think, generally.
Well, excellent. And I suppose we do have quite a bit to cover. This is going to shock no one, but the main topics are going to be Ukraine and what's happening in the Caucasus right now. Now, I do have a few miscellaneous news items that mostly about Europe and the current falling out, mainly between Poland and Ukraine, which we'll get to in due time. Don't worry. But I figured that GSP, this is normally the time, and I figured there's no reason to deviate. That you just give us some brief updates on the front in Ukraine.
Okay. So I guess the biggest news item of the week has been the Ukrainian missile attack with their Storm Shadow missiles on the Sevastopol naval base. This was, I suppose, in some ways, it wasn't a shock because the preceding day there were American Global Hawk drones flying about, which means they're kind of mapping out a route. And one of the theories I've heard banted about was, and I brought this up on the show last week, and that was that what essentially Ukraine will do is send a whole bunch of drone boats. Sometimes they're filled with soldiers. Others, the other formation of the attack is to send a whole bunch of drones. And one of the things that air defense missile systems have to do is they can't stay stationary. And so basically, the US provides information when the S-400 and S-300 systems start moving about after they've taken out a wave of drones. And that's what happened this time. There were about 20 drones. So it was an attack that was larger than usual. And no less than 10 Storm Shadows were launched. 7 were taken down. The video footage I've seen, the center, which is in the city of Sevastopol, it's not in, like I would say, the marina. It's not by the boats where the previous attack took place on the submarine and on a landing ship. It was already engulfed in smoke, and then the other Storm Shadow hit it. Now, there's reports that a Storm Shadow was hit and debris fell onto this center, and then the next Storm Shadow hit it. Now, my own feeling is after a year and a half of war, nobody, like none of the commanders are actually in these places. They're in bunkers. They're further away. Nonetheless, it is an attack, and notice that it happened on the day that Zelensky comes to Canada, right? That's very important. Sorry, that Zelensky lands in America. He's in America at the time of the attack. So that was set up as a PR move to raise everybody's morale. Because right now, of course, the U.S. Congress is in a debate about whether to send Zelensky another $24 billion. The U.S. has already committed, as much as 300 billion in total assistance. Not all of that is, of course, military, but so that I would say is the biggest story. And of course, just to briefly depart and talk a little bit about Canada, there was of course, Canada has the largest diaspora of Sikhs and the largest diaspora of Ukrainians anywhere in the world. So it's also very interesting to me that Trudeau should have accused the Indian government of assassinating uh, a Sikh leader of some kind. He wasn't technically a Canadian citizen. I guess the US version would be kind of like having a green card. He has resident status in Canada. He's officially not a citizen, as far as I understand. Now, my own feeling is that I don't know whether the Indian government did it. To a great extent, I don't really care, but because all governments do it, for me, the timing is more interesting. The narrative of this happening is far more interesting to me than anything else. Uh, Trudeau was upset, for instance, that Zelensky was not invited to the G20 meeting. And I think that America is very frustrated that they cannot get India to pivot away from the BRICS, or put, let's say, India in a more compromised position that would, in a domino effect, put BRICS in a position that would eventually affect Russia. That didn't happen, and this is a kind of retaliatory action. Now we know, because there's more information has come out, that the Five Eyes, basically the Anglosphere countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America, and Britain, already gave Canada the information that they believe that he was assassinated by the Indian government. And in fact, Sikhs in America were also warned that they're targets. So they're building the narrative that India is also an authoritarian state, and they're the bad guys.
Well,
And
I don't mean to interrupt you, GSP. I was just going to say you've probably heard recently there's all these narratives in general about of Modi's party being this Hindu nationalist party. We're hearing about all the Christians being killed, which is terrible. That's horrible. I don't want that to be happening. But you start to have to question yourself, like, am I hearing about this because the media wants to tell me about the plight of Christians, or am I hearing about this because Modi is an enemy of the GAE?
Yeah. Yes, that's absolutely correct, right? But Canada has an ongoing problem with like what I would call Khalistan Sikhs, right? Before 9/11, the biggest aviation terrorist attack was committed by Sikhs in 1985 on India Air Flight 182, where 329 people were killed. It took the Canadian government like over 12 years to lay charges on the perpetrator, whose name escapes me right now, but he only got manslaughter. Now, the year before in India, in 1984, of course, there was this slaughter at the Golden Temple in India. This is the famous Sikh temple. And then you also have the Sikh nationalist bodyguards that killed Indira Gandhi, right? So, this goes back a long way. And just to round things off, of course, Canada also had Zelensky speak at the House of Commons. And and in attendance was a 98-year-old Ukrainian who was in one of the Nazi divisions during World War II. So, the gate is able to craft this narrative where, for instance, the headlines read Ukrainian fighter who fought against Russia in World War II. Like, you already know, like, just the base level of education in the West, anyways, right? So they're liable to believe, like, maybe World War II, didn't happen the way it happened, or maybe in Ukraine things were totally different, right? Um, it, it's intentionally obscure. Like when van der Leyen was in Japan, doesn't tell you it was the Americans who dropped the two bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And the reason they did it isn't because they thought they'd have to invade Japan. Japan was going to capitulate anyways. The reason they did it is to frighten the Soviets, is to make them understand that if they step out of line, that's what would happen to them, that they have this bomb and no one else has it. It was an intimidation tactic, and they killed hundreds of thousands of people to do it.
Well, the
So
Japanese only surrendered because the Soviets invaded Manchuria anyway. So
that's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. Very good. So it's amazing how these narratives are woven. But just to now return back to the front lines, I would say that in the Zaporozhye front, the Ukrainians have moved a little bit closer to Verbove. They've gone further south and cut off one of the country roads that the Russians use to supply Verbove. This will probably make resupplying Verbove from the west, anyways, more difficult. That is, of course, unless they're getting their supplies from the east, or rather from a southeasterly direction. The front lines have not really changed that much. One of the trends that I've noticed is this week compared to last week, there are not only fewer casualties. I mean, Russian casualties since June have been very rapidly going down, but the last 3 weeks have seen Ukrainian casualties drop by 10 to 25 to 30%, depending on which front. The only exception is around the Liman front. Everywhere else, they have precipitated downwards. So they're losing less, but also the attacks aren't what they were in June, where we saw those columns. And they're not even the way the attacks were conducted in August, where they would have a platoon, say 20 men, moving at night. Those guys would get shelled. So now they're using only small units of 2 to 3 men, no more than 5. And what they do is they go to the trenches, they accumulate in the first Surovikin line. There is a trench just to stop armored vehicles. There are openings in this line, by the way. The line was never constructed without openings at all, right? But what the Russians are hoping for is these openings, of course, are easier to go through than to fill up a trench in the middle of a war. And they're going to use that as a kind of a kill zone. The Ukrainians have managed also to get into the first man trenches close to Verbove. But just understand, Verbove is just a little bit east of Robotyna. And Robotyna is a place where, well, I mean, if you look at the last 2-3 days, fab bombs are going off everywhere. Recently the Ukrainians have evacuated all the villages, including Kherson city, on the left bank of the Dnieper. That's because they're gathering more and more men. And this is an area, actually, where deaths have gone up by 100 compared to the week before. So we know there's more accumulation. The Ukrainians will probably try to do something. And in the news, you are hearing Zelensky say, no, the counteroffensive never stops. It doesn't matter if it's rain, it will never stop. It will just keep going, right? Because all the promises that they made throughout 2023 and even early 2022, late 2022, was that by next summer they would be in Crimea and the Azov Sea would be returned to Ukraine and so on and so on. Um, but I would say that's it for the front lines. The typical Russian attacks are taking place now deeper behind front lines. There was an attack, I believe, in like the far western section of Donetsk, west of Donetsk city. I think it's called Begotimir or Bigotimir. That was a serious attack. The Russians were not just using FAMs, but Iskanders. So they're really going after concentration points right now in Orehov and that area, Gulyapolye. There are two areas where they're not going after, and that is south central Ukraine. Let's say south of Kiev, north of Odessa, left of the Dnieper, but not anywhere close to Vinnytsia or Khmelnytsky, right? In this pocket, and the reason is Ukraine has at least, I think, two nuclear power plants there, and people are saying that Ukraine is actually hiding some of the Storm Shadow missiles, depleted uranium shells, and other ammunition in this area because I know the Russians won't do anything about it. They won't. And of course, we know from everybody's favorite British twit, uh, Lindy Beige, when he interviewed that Canadian. The Canadians said, yeah, they were storing soldiers and weapon material inside the Lavra in Quebec. Sorry, in Kiev. Um, so that's it. I would say right now for the front line, strategically, uh, Ukraine has to go through another mobilization, and I think this is going to be a real test. Lots of Western press are talking not only about Ukraine's heavy losses, but they're not convinced that certainly volunteering has dropped by 50% for Ukraine right now. And so that means they're going to have to force the conscripts. And, there's also more, you have Germany, Hungary, various other countries who are not, Czech Republic, who are not going to be sending back Ukrainian men to go fight in the war. They've made those statements. So, strategically right now, no one knows exactly what Russia will do. I think meeting with Kim Jong Un uh, probably means that they're going to get at least 152 millimeter shells, probably maybe some MLRS rocket supply. I'm not sure because I think the Russians understand that the potential for the war expanding with other countries getting involved is very real. And because the language isn't there. Zelensky's language at the House of Commons is the kind of language he uses all the time. They're fighting evil, the worst evil in history. Ukraine is being genocided. We can never give up. If Ukraine gives up, he'll go for Poland. It's this kind of nonsense, right? So they I mean, they've created laws that say they can never negotiate with Russia if Putin is still president, which kind of lets the cat out of the bag as to what their intent was in the provocation for this war, and that is by shelling the Donbass in early February of 2022. But that's it. I'll say for the front lines, in a nutshell.
Concise as always, and I do have to mention because it's something I harp on about the question of Poland and its involvement in the Ukraine war, and that is to bring up, just to as an addendum to this, the recent dispute between the Poles and the Ukrainians regarding the grain deal and the grain shipments in particular, which seems to have ballooned into something much larger. Now, perhaps this is just a temporary dispute between the two, or perhaps it's something that is going to grow into a much more long term disagreement, much more long term divide between both Poland and Ukraine. So, as we've covered for several months now, the Ukrainians have been trying to flood the European grain markets with cheaper, inferior product, which is completely screwing over European farmers, particularly out of less prosperous European nations such as Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, etc. And now, with this most recent push, you have Duda, who has come out, president of Poland, and threatened to withhold weapon shipments until the Ukrainians relent on this question of cheap grain shipments into the European Union. And I've been saying for months now, I am expecting Poland to get involved in this war. But I do have to say, although this is a very recent development, we still need to give it some time to see how things actually do play out in the long term. This is the biggest moment of doubt I've had towards that, because I think it's obvious that's much deeper than just grain. It's much deeper than just an agricultural dispute in the European Union. This war, on top of the cost of human life and human suffering, has had ripple effects all throughout the world. I would say particularly in the European continent. We've seen a decrease in economic growth. We've seen deindustrialization. We've seen just stagnation economically, politically, and culturally all across the continent. Some would say Germany is the worst effect, in which case I do think you can make a case for that, certainly. Others would say the UK with the way it has declined. Some would say some of the Eastern European states. But looking at Poland in particular, who has been a very fervent supporter of this war from day one, even going back before, has sent thousands of mercenaries and millions upon millions of dollars worth of equipment into this war, led the country became a hub for even more foreign equipment flowing into Ukraine. It has accepted millions of Ukrainian refugees in diaspora who have been a massive strain on the social system and just in polite society in general. There have been several cases of disputes between these new Ukrainian arrivals and the native Polish population, and those seem to increase more and more. And this isn't just in Poland, but Poland in particular, I think, is the most obvious example of this. And this is all for a country that keeps demanding more, more, and more. And I don't think this is going to be some sort of major break. I don't think this is going to break the European support for the war effort. But it does show a certain level of exhaustion that I would say Europe in particular is starting to have for this war. And you can combine that with statements that have been made over the past several months by places like France, Germany, Hungary especially. I think Hungary is the real standout in this, even though they are renegades in the European Union within their own right. But all across Europe, you've had these exasperating feelings towards this war. And that's also on top of saying they will not extradite Ukrainian diaspora and Ukrainian refugees who are fighting age males to go back to Ukraine to fight in this war. And what I think we're looking at here is I know Europe's sovereignty, of course, is completely hamstrung by Washington, that Brussels is effectively eh, delegated responsibility for an occupation regime, as I've put it several times in the past. But what we're looking at right here is a continent that has been had every penny, every resource squeezed out of it, at least seemingly at this point now, perhaps there'll be more, in order to support this war effort on behest of the empire that operates out of Washington, D.C. And I do think we're getting close to a breaking point. I wouldn't say this is a breaking point at all, but I think this is the closest we've been to a breaking point since the start of this war. now that reality is setting in. Look, the winter of 2022 going into 2023 was fortunately, just in terms of millions of lives and livelihoods, not that harsh of a winter. But when you compound this upcoming winter with the loss of the past almost 2 years at this point, things are going to start to add up, and the pain is really going to start to be felt. And of course, I'm not saying that North America, the United States, have been spared from this pain, but in terms of where hardship has actually been hitting, it has been places like Germany, it has been places like the UK, it has been places all across Europe, honestly. And I do think that it will slowly ripple over into North America, the United States in particular, with some of the just terrible economic
Inflation.
situation. Yeah, inflation in particular, but just some of the terrible economic figures that come out of the U.S. and, of course, the crumbling of basic social services, as we've seen several places, the discontent of workers, as we've seen with the current auto worker strike, as well as previously averted railway worker strikes, and also the negotiations that the government had to have with the Teamsters unions just a few months back, to the point where, yeah, everyone's starting to feel the pain. And look, these problems predate this war. Maybe if you want to be really simplistic, you could say it goes back to 2020, even though I think the entire COVID thing was just the last straw on a system that was already fragile, that did have the appearance of external strength, at least at the time, but that illusion was shattered by some of the, let's just say, more extreme responses to the debacle of 2020. And once again, we didn't even recover from that when we have this crisis piled on top of us, with severing ourselves from so much of the world economy. If you look at the just insane sanctions regiment that the United States has imposed not only on Russia but any country that dares to do business with Russia, it's completely counterintuitive to any sort of basic desire to maintain a reasonable standard of living both at home and abroad. And then if you
Mm.
want to go back even further, much of the world, including much of the United States, didn't even recover from the economic troubles of 2008.
Yeah. Conrad and Dimitri, what are your thoughts on Duda's statements? Uh, 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 regarding Poland. What's your take?
I think he has the same opinion as Constantine, right? He said we're living in an era of uncertainty. That was what he said, right? So I think I'm very much on the same page as Constantine. I've always said that Poland is probably going to be one of the first actual other state actors to get involved in this conflict, when it comes down to that. But it seems that that's being shaken a little bit. However, I'm more inclined to think that this is kind of Poland almost coming to a revelation that they've realized that they're going to get dragged into this some way or the other, and they can't be at least in their minds, they want to think they can't be some patsy or they can't be some arms hub for the Ukrainians. While they need to be building up themselves. We know they're about to spend 14% of their GDP on just hardware, not even their defense
They're not
budget,
even
just the
at war.
hardware. Yeah, just the hardware itself. They're spending 14%. So they clearly know that, things are about to get serious, and they're aware that they are on the frontier of the multipolar versus the unipolar world, and knowing that, they are perhaps realizing finally they can no longer be the scary front-facing puppet that really sends all the stuff and goes crazy and puts out all the anti-Russia statements, and like kind of like Poland was like the Baltic country with teeth, that could actually back up its statements compared to the those guys and their cope and seethe. But yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting, and I'm interested to see how the Belarus-Poland border flares up in the near future as well, because that seems to come in 3 to 5 week waves, as well, as far as border breaches and now the whole migrant situation. You were speaking about the decline of the United States. I mean, our border invasion is insane. We were just talking to Hervoje Moric of Geopolitics and Empire about this 300,000 migrants flowing across the U.S.-Mexico border every day. And you hear about Belarus, of course, weaponizing the border with Poland and everything. We hear about, in Central Asia, Russia has its issues with, non-Europeans, let's say, entering the homeland. But it is quite. I want to say, like, it could be hopeful if it could actually lead to a de-escalation from Poland, but unfortunately, I don't actually think that that's what this is. If anything, it's a hint at an even bigger armament going on.
Mm.
I just
'Cause, go ahead, Dimitri.
I wanted to comment while we're still on the subject of Poland. I think, President Andrzej Duda, because he did see probably Tucker Carlson's interview with Viktor Orban, I have no doubt about it. And he saw Viktor Orban's, and this is the
Mm.
Tucker Carlson effect. He probably saw the interview and he went, wow. So the Prime Minister of Hungary can actually give these unfiltered, uncensored opinions and can seem, somewhat anti or neutral in Ukraine. And in fact, he can get away with it. And in fact, he's probably his his support amongst this constituency could actually go up, and he becomes popular amongst the English-speaking population because Tucker Carlson is somewhat based, and look, Trump is rising, and maybe I can get on that boat as well. So I think he's finally, I guess, these independent European countries are actually waking up to the fact that, well, you don't actually have to go along with what the EU, NATO overlords demand of you. And I mean, Erdogan has shown that in Turkey in regards to NATO, that he can follow somewhat independent policies and even possibly push Azerbaijan and taking control of Armenian territory. Like it's almost like this Giga Chad type independent move from Erdogan, completely disconnected from what NATO would sanction. He can kind of do his own international affairs in the Middle East. He's his own sort of actor. But we also saw, of course, besides Andrei Duda giving his opinion that, look, we're not going to provide any more, this statement, we're not going to provide any more aid to Ukraine, or we're going to limit it severely. Also, we see even the French president, who, we all look at him as a bit of a weirdo, marrying his high school teacher, is, probably a Freemason. I mean, he has to be a Freemason, a member of all these secret societies. And then he suddenly wants to attend the BRICS summit, right, in late August, and he wants to
Yeah.
participate. He wants to be involved with the second and the third world, of the non-Europeans, and he gets rejected. And of course, Macron probably, I mean, we have all these European actors, and they're seeing that, look, maybe they're going to be left in the dirt by this globalist establishment out of New York, out of wherever they're based, and even Brussels possibly. And they're saying, well, maybe we need to have a plan B prepared. And I think Hungary and Poland are at the forefront of that.
Well, I mean, I think Duda's statement that Poland is, I mean, Ukraine is is a drowning man, and is really, I think that's the. If you had told me a year from now, or even 6 months from now, that a NATO country, Poland no less, would have described Ukraine as a dangerous drowning man that you cannot get close to because you'll die with them. Like that is, I mean, that's huge. And, like that's a really difficult statement to walk back. Like if
Well,
it's
we know
just a
how
psyop.
powerful the U.S. embassy in Warsaw is. Would they have? I mean, like I know it. I agree with you, Dimitri, that the Poles really may have just had enough. But I mean, is the U.S. I think it may depend on how this $24 billion go. But
Mm.
I've been caught. I've said a few times that there've been hints that they've seemed like they're going to tone it down. But the Biden White House always seems to ramp it back up. So I'm wondering if they got to go ahead on
Mm,
this or not.
I mean, I just think it's a very, very strong statement, and they have election night in 3 weeks, and PIS is not doing well in the polls, and it's not strictly about protecting Polish farmers from Ukrainian grain. For him to say that, that to me would be indicative that the Polish population itself, as Konstantin was saying earlier, is growing weary of the Ukrainian diaspora. It's a very, very different atmosphere from let's say the first 6 7 months of the war in 2022. Um, it'll yeah. I mean, I like your take too, though, Conrad. Like it could mean ironically a precursor to an escalation and involvement of Poland in the war. But we'll have to wait and see. It's just they're very, very, very strong statements. For Ukrainians, that has to feel like just the morale has to feel like the air just went out. So I don't know. Um, words matter in a war. I mean, it isn't always just a technology that wins the war. It's also perseverance, and if you demoralize a people like that, there are serious consequences. They're not just automatrons. Hitting the Sevastopol naval base is a morale booster, not just for
Hmm.
Ukrainian soldiers, but for the Ukrainian population. And uh, getting some 98-year old Nazi collaborator fighter, a standing ovation in the House of Commons. Like, there's even a restaurant in my city that has like Bandera stuff. You can buy.
Based Canada.
You can. But this is what I mean, right? Like, since Canada belongs to the gay and the gay is always anti-Russian, it, it's okay, right? Like, that kind of Nazism, that's okay, right? But Mark Collette is a Hitler worshiper.
Mm. It's I was just gonna say the you talked about the Polish elections. I don't want to interrupt you, Constantine, if you want to come in, but the I mean, you talked about kind of beating people down, and even some of these other countries like Poland and Austria, and obviously Austria has always been more neutral amidst all of this, but Confederacja, the quote unquote far right party in Poland that hasn't just gotten the label of far right, but also the horrible specter of pro-Russian placed over them, which is a death sentence, I guess, in European politics as far as getting observed by their feds go. But them about to become the third largest party in these elections, and the Freedom Party in Austria basically leading in the polls despite their former like pro-Russia scandal. It seems that the people in these countries like, okay, the party's pro-Russian. Who cares? Or good,
And
like people are
Robert
getting
Fico
inoculated to that.
is slated to win the Slovak election, so there's that as well.
Yes,
Mm.
that's right. Hitler did it again.
I can't believe it. He just keeps inflaming this migrant crisis so the Europeans vote for the far right parties. Look, the Guardian told me all about this. Okay, it's wild stuff. It's wild stuff. Oh, man, I
Well,
suppose.
the
Go on, please.
no, 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 no. Go ahead. You had a better
I
point
was
than me.
about to say. I suppose in that case we could talk about this recent migrant landing in Italy, and about 10,000 is the figure I've seen recently. The fact that
Hmm.
with and look, I was surprised to see that. I mean, it was up until just a few months ago in some countries where you still had a bunch of the quote unquote travel restrictions in place, but those are being slowly peeled away, and as they keep peeling these away, you have yet again another burgeoning migrant crisis. And the one in particular we have right now is boats from North Africa landing in Italy. I can't remember the name of. It's the southernmost island of Italy, south of Sicily.
Lampedusa, right?
Yeah,
Lampedusa.
Yeah.
Lampedusa, about 4,000 people. Mostly, its economy is just the fact that it is a tourist trap. It's a beach resort. That's really all it boils down to. And you have 10,000 arrivals show up there. Now, although it's doubtful that they're all just going to stay on that island, and in fact, very few of them are, we've seen this time again. We've seen this since 2015 at least, where even though they don't stay in these countries, these, let's just say, less prosperous countries in southern and eastern Europe, they still trod their way through there, leaving destruction in their wake as they go to the much more wealthy and prosperous northwestern European states, and we've seen the result of that,
A
at
little
least.
rape, a little stealing, a
Yeah,
little,
yeah,
a
just
little this and that.
diversity is the spice of life, as they say, and who are we to judge their culture? Clearly, we are the ones who have to support them. But it does make you wonder that, despite all of this, and I know that we had the incident with the Algerian diaspora having their, let's just say, grievances addressed in France a few months back, and that's the most recent event of that sort that we've seen in the past few years. Actually, there have been other instances, but that's the one that comes to mind: the Algerian protest riots that happened in France a few months ago. They are arriving in, once again, a Northern Europe and places like France, Germany, the UK, etc., that is far less economically prosperous than it was in 2015, that has far less money to dole out for these social programs, for these refugees, for these migrants, whatever you want to call them, invaders, we might as well say. And what do you think they're going to do when they get there? Putting more strain on the system, a system that's already being pushed to its limits, I would say, in an economic sense. Now, I think culturally that's a completely different discussion, but I think we all know where that's going as well. But that is yet another element of instability in these countries, yet another wedge that can be used against these. Because look, we've gone over this before on the war report. Now, I can't recall if you two have ever covered it. Which please interject if you have anything to add to this. Certainly, that's why I brought you on the show. But once again, bring in these massive people. They serve as a wedge against the native populations. It creates more political discord in these countries. It makes them easier for the, let's just say, current American empire or the regime in DC, the GAE, whatever name you want to attribute to it. It's all kind of the same thing. I think we all get the point here. But
Well, yeah, people
yeah,
say that. I was just to say real quick, people, sure, there's Ukraine, there's Armenia, Azerbaijan. There's always the ongoing Turkish, Syrian conflicts going on there. But as far as World War now, World War III goes, every Western nation is at war because they're experiencing invasion levels of migration. I've made that point since, basically
Hmm.
we started the show. I
oh,
think it's important to
absolutely.
recognize
That's
it. People are like people will say like, what do you mean there's a third world war? There's a war in Ukraine. It's like, what do you mean? Like if you're willing to talk, if you're willing to name the enemy, it's very obvious to see who's at war with who, right? And the and the when it comes to I mean, the southern border and Italy look very of America and Italy look very, very similar right now. Considering that's a shocking amount of sub-Saharan Africans are here at the American southern border as well, which
And
again,
Indians.
not that yes. And
Lot
Canada, of
Indians.
course, experiencing, ethnic conflicts that they decided to import for no good reason other than just soulless globalism.
Canada,
And
the home of
the
diaspora nationalism. It's truly a beautiful thing.
oh
like
yeah,
like every
yeah,
diaspora you
hey,
can think of
the
has
Glendale
a
the
lobbying
Glendale
base in Canada.
Armenians.
It's that. Do the Canadians have Armenians? I think that's the Glendale
We
cabal. I
do,
think
yeah.
California has
I'm
that under
saying the
lock.
Glendale Armenians, they put Canada on the they put California on the map in that race though, those Glendale
Oh
Armenians.
yeah, yeah, the
Hmm.
Glendale cabal. It's not a group I want to cross. That's for sure.
Stepanakert will be defended today immediately, tweeted from Glendale.
Uh, I mean, diaspora nationalists. I just have to say it's a wealth of entertainment, but I'm getting off track here. But I'm glad you brought up the invasion level of migrations that are currently happening in Europe and how that is overlooked by many people because at least in my personal observation, we've been doing this show since 2018, so I guess we're kind of long haulers in that sense. Now, the format has changed quite substantially, but once again, the content hasn't really. And I've tried to point this out time again because I do think it's important to bring attention to that around 2018, 2019, people just stopped talking about the migrant crisis, pretending like it stopped happening. Now, I know we actually got a brief pause in 2020 because, once again, of certain absurd events, but it, you still see stories if you do keep up with this. And yeah, it can be hard to keep up with some of the stuff, but I do think it's those of us who can do have to stomach these things and tell people to the best of their abilities that they can stomach these things. That yet you still get these social disorders that happen. You still get these violent crimes that happen. You still get this just all the n- massive negative effects of mass migration, whether that be economically, culturally, politically, in terms of, as I said, crime and safety as well. That yes, this is another front of war that is being waged, and it is interesting because I know I was making this joke earlier, but you do see the narrative trying to peddle that Wagner Black Ops in Africa, no pun intended there, is the reason why Europe has these waves of mass migration. Just ignore that NATO decided to remove Gaddafi, what, I think, yeah, 12 years ago at this point, we're coming up on the 12th anniversary of that, decided to destroy the wall in North Africa that was so carefully constructed. that once again Gaddafi himself said, if I go, this is going to happen. I'm not saying you have to say Colonel Gaddafi was this great guy or whatever. But the point being is, he's certainly proven himself in hindsight to be preferable to the alternatives. If anyone with any degree of honesty can admit that, or
And then when Tunisia wants to kick out blacks, we like threaten to sanction them or whatever. You know, like what are we trying to
Hmm.
do here? Like, remember they had to do that whole thing, and the next thing you know, we're talking about how evil of a country Tunisia is. It's like, who's causing the migrant
yeah,
crisis
and
here?
then
Because it sounds like
I don't know
it's
if you recall the
Yeah.
Morocco Western Sahara dispute from a few years back, but this keeps happening time again where it is
we gave
just
them Western Sahara because Morocco decided to be friends with Israel.
yeah, it's
Yeah. Yeah.
just an unrelenting wave of and like I said, I don't mean to harp on this too much, but and I'm not blaming anyone in particular. I'm not trying to stand up here on some soapbox and pretend like I'm better than anyone. Don't get me wrong, but there has been a severe overlooking of the migrant crisis in the past, I would say 3 to 4 years, where people have just completely forgotten about this. Now I know so much more has happened, especially with the outbreak of war in Ukraine. It has become kind of uh, easy to overlook that in favor of the largest military conflict since the end of the Second World War. But I do think you need, and I think everyone here understands, but just speaking to a general audience, that we need to keep hammering this point. We need to keep reminding people that this is the migrant crisis. They're going to go harder than ever, especially now with everything that is on the line, and that a lot of people are going to suffer because of this. And I would say it
Well,
is.
frankly, Dimitri is the only person I know in the. I don't want. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just
No,
don't want
go
to miss
ahead,
this
please.
point. Is Dimitri's like the only person I know like talking in the English language about the Russian crisis? You know, Dimitri, I want you to talk on that a little bit because no one talks about the fact that Russia has the longest border in the world with Central Asia, and those people want to come in and get Gibbs too.
Oh
Well,
no,
yeah. So Russian Orthodox.
the people, the steps. It all just
But
keeps happening again and again.
The tale is old as
the
time. Yeah.
so so it's really unappreciated. So the East is usually considered, people simply don't look at the map. For example, World War One, everyone talks about the Western Front between France and Germany and the Somme, the trenches. They don't realize that the Eastern Front was 4 times as long in terms of geography. It was just incredibly unmanageable, and you can say in the same tone the unmanageability of just the geographic border between Russia and Kazakhstan. To Russians, it was known, as soon as the Afghanistan war essentially broke down and Afghanistan was essentially turned into a, heroin began flowing north, let's just say in the 1990s. A lot of Russians, of course, went on the needle and the drug crisis began. It wasn't just the vodka and alcoholism which was killing the Russian depressed populace, especially not the boomers, but perhaps the Gen Xers, right? Who, maybe were in their mid 20s and they had no economic prospects. They weren't related to the oligarch class in the 90s. They began dying to this heroin and opiates coming from Central Asia, right? And of course, this was completely unhinged. You had bribery going on between the borders of Kazakhstan and Russia, and this has continued to this day. And only this year, this is the first time in my life, actually, and probably since 1991, have we seen massive crackdowns in Russia proper, in cities like Samara, Yekaterinburg, Nizhny Novgorod, like
Yep.
pretty large million-person cities, right? We've seen Russian feds and police raiding MMA gyms, raiding and of course the Chechens and the Dagestani Muslims are they're chimping out about it because they're saying, "Oh, our fellow Muslims, like these people are not Dagestanis or Chechens; they're illegal immigrants from Central Asia who have arrived because of unhinged Russian domestic and I guess border policies and bribery and complete corruption." And now, for some reason, the Russian government is cracking down. And it's not just, of course, I may be the only, I guess, English speaking person of Russian background speaking about it on Twitter, for example. But they're in Russia itself. I'm not sure if RT has jumped on the bandwagon, given that RT is run by the CEO, the editor in chief is Margarita Simonyan, the second most famous Armenian woman in the world after Milady Kim Kardashian. But Margarita Simonyan, of course, being an immigrant herself, probably doesn't want to bring this subject up. That's why RT maybe perhaps is a little bit more sensitive. But Sargrad, right? Sargrad TV, we talk about it all the time. You can say like about 1 million subscribers it had on YouTube before the massive censorship, and they began really circulating this idea during the SMO 2023 that Russia has an illegal immigrant crisis of Central Asians. And this is not nothing to say about Uzbeks, Tajiks, Kyrgyzstanis, Turkmenistanis. These people arriving in Russia because of the unhinged border policy. As you mentioned, in Europe, it's basically in Spain and Italy, like God knows what's going on. It's the fault of the local politicians not the actual in many ways not even the immigrants themselves, because they simply use, I guess, the opportunity given to them for more Gibbs, right? I mean, that's just, it's basic human nature to, I guess, want more and want a better life for yourself. So,
Oh
and
no,
of
these
course,
people
there
are
needs to
complete
be.
proxy warriors, and I do think
Hmm?
while many of them are of low moral character, as shown by the kind of actions they do commit, a lot of them are just people just who are taking opportunities given to them. And I do like to bring up this point whenever I can that you can address a problem on a macro level while having individual sympathies, but also realize still once again the situation at hand. Like I'm and people who
Hmm.
are of course all for the open borders love to harp on this. Oh, you're just so hateful. You're such a bigot, etc., etc., etc. We've all heard this for the past
And let's be
decade or
frank.
so.
Let's
But
be
yeah,
frank.
go ahead, go
If
ahead.
the Syrian refugee crisis, if the Syrian refugee crisis was actually strictly enforced, just Syrian women and children, actually from Syria in the conflict zones, that actually would have been completely capable of a competent European bureaucracy to deal with. But for some reason, the Syrian refugee crisis turned into let every person from Afghanistan and sub-Saharan Africa into Europe. And obviously, we know that the taking down of Gaddafi had to, and all of these other conflicts that were ginned up by, Israeli Twitter during the Arab Spring was the led to this kind of going global in that regard. But at the end of the day, we still are hearing to this day it's the Syrian refugee crisis. It's like honestly, like sure there are some bad Syrian apples out there as well, but like how many of these people are even hearing about or even affected by that conflict, which supposedly precipitated all of this?
And I love that you brought up the Syrian thing because here is just I don't even know what word to assign to it. Perhaps one of you have a word to assign to it where the conflict in Syria has mostly subsided. And look, one thing I know he had a mixed bag, mixed legacy. One thing I'll give Trump a lot of credit on is he at least eased a lot of support to the more radical groups who were supporting in Syria. I'm not saying he cut it completely, not that he was even able to, but he let up on the pressure there, which allowed the forces on the ground, whether that be the Syrian government forces, Russians, etc., to actually eliminate groups like ISIS. And now I'm not saying that groups like ISIS don't exist. Of course, we do see the flare-ups in places in eastern Syria quite frequently. Actually, it happens quite often. Just a lot more news comes up that is more pertinent. So unfortunately, we don't get to cover a lot of the Middle Eastern stuff nowadays. But once again, you have that, and you also have the crippling sanctions on Syria. And you'll recall during the earthquake, there were several more pragmatic European countries, will say, that tried to provide some aid to Syria, but were impeded from doing so because of these crippling sanctions. And once again, I know that these people live for hypocrisy. I know that you can't hold them to their standards because they have no standards. That you want to complain about the Syrian refugee crisis, which, of course, as you just explained, was the umbrella for anything and anyone they wanted to let in. That this country, where the war has mostly subsided, you are still keeping crippling sanctions, making just day to day life harder and harder for the average people, occupying a third of the country with some dubious paramilitary organization, if not outright terrorist organization, that being the SDF. And you won't let up, which of course in turn justify. Of course, we have to send more Syrians, quote unquote Syrians, to places like Europe, to places like, to a lesser extent, America. But you get the point here. And I think everyone at this point knows why they conduct the so-called migrant crisis the way they do. But as I like to say, repetition is key, and we just need to hammer these points home. And because it's still ongoing, this is not something that has just stopped. And you can talk to people who live in these frontier zones, and you can talk to them about what happened to their quality of life once these people started showing up, the way they trounced themselves through, the reason the Hungarians built a wall on the border, the reason why they're in constant talks with the Serbians about this migrant crisis. And like I said, even if they don't stay in a country, because I would say that the northwestern European countries, and just broadly speaking, not any precise term, Germany, UK, Ireland, France, Belgium, etc., etc., have bore the brunt of this because this is where these people usually stay. But the damage that, once again, the damage that they do along the way still leaves, just, it's irreparable damage in many ways that's created along the way. And there's no end in sight. There's no stopping it. And Maloney, not that I ever had too high hopes of her government, just knowing what about her background, is so detestable because, once again, you'll even get somebody who just champions the idea of sovereignty and closing the border and making sure we have security, making sure we don't have millions upon millions of people coming in who put a strain on the social system and on polite society in general, and then not only passively let it happen, but actively facilitate it. Such a, once again, you have to trust
Women in
somebody for it to,
politics, man, never again.
I mean, goes without saying, but you have to trust somebody for it to be an actual betrayal. So there's that, but it's time and time again. And I completely understand that the NGOs, the powers that be, will artificially increase migration when parties in the right are in power as a demoralization tactic. But once again, these sellouts always do this. And look, I know it's trite. I don't want to say there's no political solution because, once again, we all know the implications of that, and I'm not exactly wanting to get on this on a public platform. I think I've made my position clear. I'll just say that much. But once again, I feel like a broken record here. I feel very trite saying, yeah, you can't vote your way out of this, whatever, and that there has to be some sort of comprehensive solution. And once again, putting the necessary disclaimer, I'm not suggesting anyone do anything illegal, radical, etc. You're responsible for your own actions. If you're an organization, you're responsible for your own actions, etc., etc. But at some point, it's gonna sound cliche. Once again, I'm sorry for bringing up all the classic hits here. There has to be somebody somewhere that wakes up to this. There has to be some sort of comprehensive solution making because clearly we're not getting that from our governments on either side of the Atlantic or anywhere in the world for that matter when it comes to this crisis. And it's one of these things that, yeah, you're going to have to plan for your own safety. You're going to have to plan for the safety of the people you care about, your community, and everything else that entails. But because at this point, we're stranded. There is very little that we can actually do to counter this.
It's
Need to
kind of
harness
like
the
funding
power
for
of the
you.
raw romantic. Go ahead, GSP.
I was just going to say it's kind of like funding for Ukraine and the border. All of this stuff, it can only stop once the world reserve currency is no longer the American dollar.
That will never happen
Because
if
it
Javier
just
Milei has anything to say about it, man.
I hate to say it, but there's no incentive, and you need the most, I don't know, the most darkest of incentives to stop these people. Um, they're only doing this because they're in a sweet spot. They have a tremendous amount of almost unlimited power, and there's just no incentive for them to stop. Right? Like there isn't a counter elite in America that's capable of dethroning these people, and that's the problem, right? They would have to lose, like they would have to lose so much power themselves for this policy change. That's what they would have to go through, and I don't see that yet. I see the signs of that happening, but I don't see like its fulfillment yet. Um, I don't know. There isn't anybody in the West. There's no counter elite that's going to just formally change this.
Well, I think GSP. On one hand, you are correct. On the other, I think on a more positive note, it's more about each individual Western country. More like I'm a little bit against grouping up, say, the West and saying the West needs to be united by one particular elite because I think, as we've seen in Ukraine as a case study, right, sort of not rejecting that there was funding from the Russian or even the Western side of either part of the conflict, but in 2014 we did see essentially a ground roots political movement in eastern Ukraine arise and essentially fed post their way to what you could call as like de facto independence, which we saw the Ukrainian Party of the Regions, which was the oppositionary party to Poroshenko, and I mean even no, it's pre-Poroshenko, so this is anti-Maidan, but also against the mainstream Ukraine, and we saw people
But
like Oleg Tsaryov, Gubaryov, and
Dimitri, they didn't meme their way. They had billionaires. They had
they had
American
local
investors.
millionaires.
They had American intelligence and coordination, and even non-Ukrainian, and those Ukrainian billionaires and millionaires, they listened to America. America nurtured these people. The day after the war, World War II ended,
Well, I'm speaking.
Hey, man.
there's no way these people would have been able to do this without America's assistance.
Well, I'm speaking.
Impossible.
Well, 100%, but I'm speaking less about Yanukovych, the Maidan, or even like Poroshenko, who later came to power. I'm speaking more about the actual Orthodox conservatives in eastern Ukraine, so in the
Oh,
Donbass.
okay,
So actually,
okay.
yeah,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
but you are right.
No. Sorry. I misunderstood you. I thought you meant like the Bandera. I'm very sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean, if I think
Because in a
for
way they also memed their way into this.
absolutely,
Right?
I think on both
On the
sides it was
surface it
memes.
looks like that.
On both sides, like I mean, you had Strelkov posting in his live journal for like years on end between 2008 and 2014, his like essentially dressing up as a World War One Russian Civil War soldier and just larping his way to writing his historical articles, and then suddenly he, of course, given his military experience, is drafted into this commando squad of 53 troops they're sent into Crimea, and then he drives his way all the way to Slavyansk, and he captures all the I guess it was the gets hold of some ATM machines, gets hold of the local police station, and essentially you have this local uprising. But it's very romantic. But for I guess for Russian speakers, and I think even for Orthodox Christians around the world, it is this example of, well, once the you can't actually force the corrupt country to fall apart in and of itself, right? So you can't, you obviously cannot resort to terrorism, you cannot resort to any criminal activity, but the corrupt system itself will eventually fall apart, and when it does, you need to be ready to do what must be done, which is probably why, which is why the party, the Angry Patriots Club today in Russia, that's exactly what they were saying when Prigozhin was driving his tanks at Moscow. They were saying, look, we don't know what the outcome will be, but we need to be ready for any potential future, possibilities inside of Russia, as well as any political reforms. But we won't be the catalyst of the absolute destruction that Prigozhin may cause if the Wagner enters Moscow. And I think that's the stance in America. So when the GAE begins to fall apart, there needs to be local
Yeah,
communities
yeah.
around,
Yes.
not just Orthodox priests, because it's not up to the priests to go make these calls. All right, you guys need to take this particular area or secure this suburb. It's not up to but the priests also need to be present. But there needs to be an understanding that lay people of esteem, of good character, and I completely agree with Fuentes. There needs to be people of good character who aren't marred and ridiculous, who don't have a bizarre history of degeneracy, need to be held in high esteem in the communities and fostered right now while there is still this downtime. I mean, right now it's almost like there's this benefit in the West that yes, there is a slow burn degeneracy building up, but at the same time, there's also an opportunity for local Christian groups and local Christian communities. I don't mean to say groups as in militias or some sort of radical organizations, but actual communities to build up and to prepare, network that, because and eventually it will fall apart, and it may coincide with like the BRICS rising, multipolarity, the dollar failing, the entire fiat system, frankly, right, going to
Yeah,
you know
that's what I meant about the early signs are here, but the fulfillment isn't, and that's what I meant about as long as
but yeah.
as long as a dollar remains the world currency, because in effect it's like, I mean, it's not gold, but in some ways it's like a gold replacement, right? Imagine a country that can just produce its own gold.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's
Right, it gives it almost limitless power, and that is what gives them their hubris.
but actually being informed about the possible collapse when it does occur, or even the partial collapse. We saw, I mean, the last Trump Biden election, that was nuts. I mean, I've never seen anything in my life similar in the West, where
I know.
literally the presidency was frozen, put on hold, even until January 6th, when it was just, you were just unsure what was going to take place. The system is buckling, and it's simply about being prepared, looking after yourself, staying healthy spiritually, physically, mentally, and just being prepared because the 2014 for the West or for each individual Western country will come eventually, right? And you have to be ready. Ukraine had its 2014. Russia may still have its 2014 moment, especially once Putin goes because he's turning 71 this year, and there doesn't seem to be any, any sort of real
Hmm.
continuity post. But that's of course a separate discussion that we may have. But you know what I'm saying? Like everyone needs
Yes.
to be ready, and even Russians inside of Russia, the Russian nationalist people like Strelkov, who's sitting in prison right now for literally nothing, for not even a Fed posting. The things I've tweeted out would put me into a Russian prison a lot faster than why Strelkov is sitting behind bars now.
Hmm.
And a lot of the a lot of the things I see, even American Orthodox folks post online, would put them into a Russian prison a lot quicker and faster than for what Strelkov's sitting in right now. So we just need to consider the fact that look, when everyone needs to be ready for that 2014 moment of their Russian Spring, which was what the Russians called it, the rise of Novorossiya. So there will be a Texas Spring, there will be a West Coast Spring, an Appalachian Spring of sorts. And it's not to say that America needs to fall apart, but locally, I think there needs to be some sobriety. And I don't mean to monologue too long, but you know what I'm saying. I think there is
Hmm.
hope,
I do.
and it's not. And 2014 has shown me that, and the SMO is essentially chapter two of that
Well,
particular.
hey, any Texas fans? I'm going to be at the Texas Nationalism
Phase.
Conference in November. So anyone wants to meet up there, you can see me in Waco. But I know it's not my show, but I wanted to ask Constantine and Gias. Well, firstly, I wanted to make sure I say what I'm trying to make my trademark like statement if I'm ever looked back on as a geopolitical commentator, which is, were they calling it World War II during the Anschluss? Not necessarily. So I think we're
Mm-hmm.
we're in that we're kind of in that era right now. But I wanted to ask you guys what your thoughts on Strelkov were. Like, what do you think is going to happen to him? Like, is it over?
Why don't you go ahead, Constantine? I mean, I don't. I have some ideas, but nothing definite.
I'm very uncertain on the question. I think it is a bit of the current regime in Russia lashing out. I don't think that he's going to languish in captivity forever, but it's something they did out of frustration. It arguably is a very, and I would say yes, it was a very petty move on their part. But I think it's going to get to the point where they're going to look at this and realize that no, it's not worth keeping this guy in prison, and that I'm not even saying that they're going to just concede and say, oh, he was right, whatever. But I I'm not quite sure once again what exactly to make of the Strelkov situation. But like I said, I don't think he's down for the count yet, so to speak. And I do think that we will hear more from what shape that will take. We'll see because now I haven't checked any like Russian public opinion on this, but to my understanding, he still is relatively well regarded in the public. And I'll be honest, if that really is the case, if I am to believe that it is a bit of a blemish on the Russian government, and I would say in particular Putin, because of the, of course, central role he has in the Russian government. It is a bit of a blemish on his record that somebody like that, and I do think it is just drawing more attention in the end to what Strelkov said, and if they're trying to deflect his criticisms of the war, however valid or invalid they may be, then they're accomplishing the exact opposite of that.
Well, I don't know if Shelkov, didn't get into art school or anything, but he may write a biography, and this could be the beginning of something big for him. Let's put it that way. Sorry, I'm
Hmm.
sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Everyone here understands that reference.
I'm just so I'm sorry.
Don't be.
Well, I think the election of Zelensky in 2019 has shown that you could literally have any sort of background, I suppose, in Eastern Europe, and of course, be under the tutelage of West, and you can kind of fool your way into politics without any sort of background. I mean, Dmitry Medvedev himself, you know, without Putin's sort of. I mean, Dmitry Medvedev, I'm not really a big fan of him. In fact, I think he's probably behind even Gaddafi's fall in 2011 because well, the Russian economy suffered greatly in the 2008 crisis, and I think he probably greenlit the taking down of Libya, well, because this all happened under Medvedev's Russian presidency. So Medvedev's a questionable figure, and the fact that he's such a hawk these days really makes me kind of he does have this chameleon factor to him. But nevertheless, it does it kind of does paint the figure that Russian politics is a bit of a gray area, I think, to a lot of people, even Russian speakers themselves. So it's not like I think, yeah, but look, Zelensky has shown in 2019 that anything is possible. And let's not forget, guys, March next year, March 2024, I think it's right after the beginning of Great Lent, the Russian and Ukrainian elections back to back are going to take place. So, of course, much to everyone's appreciation. So we'll see who gets elected, but I think there pretty much won't be much competition.
Well, I mean, I'll give you my 2 cents on Strelkov. I have to say there was a lot about Strelkov I didn't know until I listened to your show. You know, other than that, you know, like for instance, I don't think when he got into the arguments with Prigozhin, or he went to the trenches, and I thought, like, I don't think that was a successful move. He's obviously aged. He's gained a lot of weight, and I know it means something to him, but I don't I don't think it was. I don't know. It didn't seem to me like. I know what he did in Serbia. I know the man is capable of heroism. It's not. It has nothing to do with any of that, right? Um, I'm I'm still at a loss as to why the Russian government locked him up in the first place. That's the part that doesn't make sense. I understand, like, part of it is um, the Russians just not not necessarily being prepared for the turn of events with the SMO. I mean, I'm sure they thought, what if the peace agreement in Istanbul, like, because there were two failed Minsk agreements, that's why there's a war. What if that goes south? I think the concern of the Russian government, to sum it up with everything I've said, is the Russian people. And I think, for instance, the Ukrainians are also betting on that. They're betting on that the Russians don't have the stomach, and they can make their lives more and more uncomfortable, and that's the only way they can get Russia to capitulate. And I think Strelkov was looked at somebody that was maybe, like Prigozhin, too critical. Uh, I personally don't. I personally never had anything against either of them. And I'm, as I've said on the show many times, I was banned from like 4 or 5 different chats, and then months later, other chats banned me, even though I hardly ever said anything. Like Joaquin Flores' chat banned me.
Wow.
Russians with Attitude banned me. Levy's channel banned me.
For what?
I don't know. I don't know. But they're
Hmm.
circulating this information because it was Slavyangrad.
Anti-Macedonian hate crime.
So I don't understand. But the reason I was banned was I was very critical of what was happening. And and on the show we said, if Russia has one major more retreat, like the
Mhm.
kind that happened in Kherson and Kharkov,
Mhm.
they're going to, like, they're going to break the morale of the citizens and the military. Now, Constantine and I can be totally wrong about that, but we felt very strongly about it. I don't know. Does the Russian government, are they very sensitive after what happened? You know, uh, what was it? The Lepin, the Russian general. He was
Mm.
telling Putin, like, to start conscription sooner. But again, I think the delay for conscription was also a fear of how the Russian public would react. Like, there was a kind of unpreparedness for even for Russia for this war. Economically, yes, they were very prepared. Maybe Strelkov and Prigozhin went too far. I mean, at the moment, I mean, even Surovikin now has like some strange role in the CIS. He's visited Algeria. That's going to be very important. His role is still important, but it's a very different one than the one he had in the SMO. So I wonder, like, could that be it? There's something that doesn't add up. Is Strelkov's voice like so persuasive? Because I don't think anybody can argue that in Russia, Prigozhin eclipsed Strelkov in terms of popularity. Also in terms of, let's say, infamy.
Mm.
Um,
I think what you'll find in terms of popularity, Stelkov has not ever been shown on mainstream media in Russia, on the television or on mainstream radio channels. So that's one thing. So his name has not been mentioned in a similar fashion to how, I mean, you can compare him to liberal oppositionary leaders as well, like Alexei
yeah,
Navalny, for example. But that's not to say that he's like Navalny, but he did have that public debate with Navalny, which still has like 5 million views on YouTube, which is pretty enormous for a Russian-speaking pure, debate video. Kind of boring as well, frankly. It's not a really good debate. But nevertheless, the fact that Strelkov has not appeared on any Russian mainstream media channels
mm,
means that there are people in power who simply don't want him to be heard. They want to ignore him. Similar to how Alex Jones for decades was ignored, right, in America. Or there simply wasn't mentioned until he went on Joe Rogan, or he was seen as this fringe figure. And we can mention even more radical, you can say, right wing figures, like and even our own Jay Dyer. Like, he's never going to go on like a Fox News. He's never even going to be brought on for an expert opinion. Why? Because they know who he is. They have a dossier on him. They have a brief on him, and it's simply like, okay, this guy is too dangerous. His opinions simply can't be voiced, right, for the mass public to take it on board. But I would say Prigozhin a lot more popular. And naturally, you saw how even when he entered Rostov on Don, what were the people doing? They were like bringing the Wagner troops cans of Coke, like bringing they're like, "Oh, come to McDonald's, we'll have a burger, whatever," right? Even though McDonald's was banned, it was probably like Don Mac or something, right? But
yeah,
like,
Just Tasty. Let's go get some Just Tasty.
but the people
yeah,
greeted
yeah.
him with flowers and with cheers. And even when Prigozhin was leaving, people were like, "Yeah, high five, can I get a selfie?" It's like, what's going on here? Like, this is like the opposite of January 6th, where it was like fear on the streets in Washington D.C. It was like the opposite. It was like, and nobody even asked why this man was even in Rostov, and why is that? Well, one of the factors was because Prigozhin and Wagner were PR to all hell all of 2023, because we know Bakhmut began in early December last year. I mean, you guys covered it pretty frequently and in much
Mhm.
detail, maybe even more than me and Conrad did, frankly, because we thought it was somewhat redundant and the siege was very, very long. And, but nevertheless, Bakhmut, Wagner, Prigozhin were PR'd to all hell on mainstream media, as well as the name Wagner was the only thing you could see on Russian TV from December until March, April. So everybody knew who Wagner was, the organization. Everybody knew who Prigozhin was. Strelkov, even in 2014, was almost unmentioned, even when he was
Mhm.
at his peak. No, and like, not even going to mention what on Telegram. Like, he is nearing 1 million Telegram subscribers, right? Which is almost as much as,
Yeah,
say, Dmitry Medvedev. But he's still not getting the coverage. So that's the only thing I would say. And for viewers, I'm not taking a position here. I'm just saying that's why Prigozhin was more. And I mean, Prigozhin even received the rest in peace from Putin himself when he passed away, despite even the what happened on June 24th. So, I mean, Putin mentioned his name and mentioned that, yeah, we were mates back in the day and he did things for the common good. Even though, I mean, what do you mean common good? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, it's like this interesting, like, he was a bro sort of rhetoric. That will never be repeated about Strelkov, even if Strelkov gets Vladlen Tatarsky at a
mhm.
bar, or he gets Daria Dugin near Rublyovka, like 10 kilometers away from Putin's house. He'll never get the same sort of address. And not just saying that about the Russian politicians. I think, unfortunately, even from some of the Russian church leadership, Stelkov will not receive the same sort of, and that's due to servilism and cowardice. He will not receive the same
Well,
sort of, I guess, respect, even if he gets taken out by Ukrainian terrorists.
Yeah. I mean,
well, GSP.
even if I played devil's advocate and said, and you can correct me if on this if my assumptions are wrong. But even in 2014, when he wanted to like combine a force and go to Kharkov, like from what I understand, a lot of his actions were foolhardy because the manpower just wasn't there. But he's not the only one who has criticized Russia for not responding more quickly and not allowed the Ukrainians, let's say, for 8 years to gather their strength. That said, if you look at what the financial, because I don't want to veer off too much off topic, but if you look at the kind of investments that um, China was pumping into America from the early 2000s, it peaked at 2016, and right after Trump got elected, it just cratered, and then it went back up around 2017, 2018, and then a huge precipitous drop beginning in around 2020. Um, I'm not sure that Russia, because there were two camps basically, right? In the American elite group, one was saying we have to cozy up with the Russians in order to contain China. The other one said, no, we have to destroy them first. Then they can, as vassals, they can cozy up with us and we can destroy China. But we cannot leave them intact. So that said, Russia in a way had to delay this until they put in an alternative, let's say for the SWIFT system, until they got China on board. They had to do a lot of convincing. I sometimes wonder if Strelkov understood that. Uh, it still wouldn't explain to me why he would have to be locked up, though.
Well, that I want to. You mentioned the withdrawal from Kherson and Kharkov, and Russia couldn't handle that. And maybe we haven't said those exact words, but we basically agree with that on the show. We've said that yeah, this can't be happening again. And the reason the Strelkov arrest kind of worried me so much was because, well, we have entire episodes behind our paywall about this because talk about who did it, it gets spicy. But what happened right before the Kherson withdrawal? Well, they killed Stremusov, who was extremely based and knew what was going on and was saying how it would be a betrayal if the Russians withdrew. And next thing you know, he's splattered across the pavement driving across the oblast. And it kind of makes you think, well, if they had to get rid of him, the deputy head of the province with a large online audience from a right wing perspective, what are they locking Strelkov up to have? Like, what's going to happen in the next, month that they can't have this guy posting to his million Telegram followers? And I mean, we haven't seen exactly what that is yet, but I had speculated that it might be another partial mobilization. I speculated it might, the black pill scenario is a terrible treaty attempt or an attempt at peace talks or something. But, there was, of course, the speculation that maybe they knew about the Prigozhin coup because Strelkov, of course, had to release his statement through his lawyers and wife when that was down because he was, just been locked up. So, maybe that had been anticipated and they wanted to suppress that. Of course, maybe some prosecutor just doesn't like him personally and decided they wanted to arrest him. It could be as simple as that, right? We said that at the beginning. But at the end of the day, they've pushed his trial date back to almost the end of the year. So, there must be something, I think.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, I agree with you. And what was the name of the Russian who was killed? Who said if they leave Kherson, it will be a betrayal? Because we were saying
Kirill Stremosov. Yeah, he was.
So
Yeah.
we were saying the same thing. This is horrible, right? Like, yeah, maybe the people in Russia, outside of the Russian-controlled territories in Ukraine, maybe this is something in the back of their minds, and they're not thinking about it that deeply. But those people in Novorossiya and in Donetsk and Lugansk, they are, and I thought it was terrible. I thought, like, I understand pragmatically why it happened, but that's why there are plans. And I think a lot of this is probably has to do again with criticism of Russian command. And I think it looks like Gerasimov and Shoigu, they don't like it. And you have this triumvirate of Putin, Gerasimov, and Shoigu, they're in charge now. Well, let's see if they deliver, because this the I think the next 4 months are really going to be very telling about what it is that they might or may not be able to accomplish, and because it will be a very big test for the Ukrainians. So again, did it have to do with just criticism? Are they very touchy about it? Are they afraid that they need to keep a total lock on how Russians think about the SMO, and it can only come from Putin and Shoigu?
I think you're absolutely right. I think it is a lock on information. It is totalitarian in that sense, in a light version of what we saw during the Soviet period, where during the Afghanistan campaign you really couldn't say, well, there weren't any hippie protesters against the Soviet Afghani campaign in the 70s, right? So like Afghanistan was a just SMO operation as well, and there was no, you couldn't question it if you were, say, an Orthodox priest in the Soviet Union at the time, same as today in Russia. There isn't really any, that you cannot have a second opinion. And I'm not saying people, there are, of course, people inside of Russia, commentators. There are actual communist, Marxist commentators who are against the war. There are patriotic commentators who are very critical of the war. If there are even Orthodox clergymen who are really, questionable. Like we mentioned, the metropolitan, so the Bishop of Kazakhstan didn't attend the liturgy with all the other bishops in Russia at the last big hierarchical council in Moscow, because they were praying for the Russian troops. So he's just like, nah, don't worry about me, guys. I'm going to sit out. It's like, whoa. I mean, he's not openly against the war, naturally, but you have Russian bishops even showing that their displeasure. They're not sure about what exactly is happening. And similar to us, there is this speculation, and there is this political and geopolitical fog of war. It's like, well, should a Russian bishop, should a Russian Orthodox clergyman even trust Lavrov? Like, who is Lavrov again? What has he done for, like, the church, for example? Like, there are these questions arise, and like, I mean, the Prigozhin situation showed it quite openly when the Russian patriarch and the Russian bishops, multiple of them, had to announce public prayers against the civil war within 24 hours. So they had to announce, okay, everybody go to church. We have to pray that Russia is saved from the beginning of a civil war. Turned out the whole Prigozhin thing was, if anything, an inside job of sorts, right? It was like, oh wait, I mean, he was just one of the, he just had, it was a test, or it was a psyop. We still don't know exactly what that was. And so this aura of uncertainty, it does give more power to figures like Strelkov, who are more critical inside of Russia. It does give Strelkov this Alex Jones, energy. It's like, well, did 9/11 really happen, or like, was it really Osama? Well, was Prigozhin always working with Putin? What about Gerasimov, and are they actually? Is Gerasimov and Shoigu, are they planning to have this weird peace treaty? Even considering the fact that you mentioned Kherson and Zaporozhye, the two main cities, the capitals of these two oblasts, are actually not under Russian control. And well, I mean, we're sitting here at the end of September, at the 1 year anniversary of when Putin actually signed these two oblasts into the Russian constitution. So how can there be a peace treaty now without these two cities inside of the Russian Federation as its sort of member cities? It's just bizarre. So obviously, no peace treaty can be signed yet, because that would be a huge political and PRL for the Russian side. But there is that, Conrad did mention, there is that black pill scenario for the Russian side, and for, I guess, everybody who's pro multipolarity, that Russia does cave in, and it does sign that peace treaty, and and Zelensky as well has to cave in, because we mentioned Ukhrvodia yesterday, and I'm sure you guys covered the United Nations speech of Zelensky, where it was extremely hawkish, and Zelensky really has shown that, look, we still want Crimea, we still want Donetsk, we still want Lugansk, and despite the fact that Lugansk and Donetsk recently had elections, and they voted their own deputies in and their own members of parliament, it still doesn't matter. Ukraine still wants those lands for itself. So I mean, for both sides, it looks like war is the way to go. Like, peace would not satisfy neither the Ukrainians, nor would it even satisfy the patriotic Russians. And that seems to be at the moment, that seems to be the status quo. But yes, there is that scenario of, like, well, and someone like Strelkov, mind you, that's the one thing he's kind of consistent on, is the fact that he doesn't want a Minsk free. Which, I mean, you mentioned it, just the fact that Minsk 1 and 2 were complete failures, and the council, the Chancellor of Germany has openly proven to us that by giving the statement that Minsk one and two were complete false agreements. And so how can we ever trust the West of the Minsk Three? We simply can't. So
Mm.
so how can we go on through diplomacy? It's very, very hard. I mean, can you even use an Erdogan? But Erdogan backstabbed Russia too, right? So you can't even trust
Yeah,
Erdogan to be a middleman. This is a really tight situation. He let Finland and Sweden, even after the Quran burnings, and I mean, Putin had to freaking grab the oldest Quran in Dagestan in order to appease the Muslims because the Muslims were burning Qurans in Sweden. It's like, what's going on? It's like complete, like Russia's trying to uh, I mean, it's because the West, of course, there's Russia is only 150 million people. The West is, well, we're looking at least 800 million. There's a lot more countries involved. Russia is fighting. It's in the minority here, and Russia doesn't have as many allies
mm-hmm.
as it probably wishes it did. And Xi Jinping, of course, is. China is like a sleeping dragon. It's like by the time it awakens, the Germans might be at the Ural Mountains, if you know what I mean. So, I don't.
And
It's a tight, yeah, it's a tight rope to walk on.
Yeah.
well, I was just going to quickly say you talked about the black pill situation, but if somehow it could get even worse, if that situation's on the table, then hell, at that point, maybe New Heavenly Jerusalem is on the table, which at that point, I mean, then it's really then it's
Oy,
then
oy
it's really not
vemos.
looking good. If
Constantine, you're actually completely right. I think either you or GSP at the beginning you mentioned the two regions in Ukraine which were not being bombed by the Russians, right? One of them being the Carpathian Mountains in the south, I mean
Yes.
northwest, and the other region being that sort of more or less valley-like region. And guess what city falls into that region? Uman, of course. And Uman, of course, currently is having that famous pilgrimage. And as we see the oppression of the Orthodox Christians in Ukraine, we have certain people attending a pilgrimage completely unmolested. If anything, they're given support of not just the entire local police force, but also they're having international police or like police security arrive with them to Uman, and it's getting a little bit wild. So we are seeing who exactly is privileged in Ukraine, and it's almost caricaturish because,
I will
as you
once
said,
again
there's like
say, Oi
90.
Gevalt.
Hmm?
Um,
Then there's 98-year old like Wehrmacht veterans, almost giving sick calls in the Canadian Parliament while there was a pilgrimage going. It's like a complete duality. It's chaos. It's literally like a Warhammer-esque type chaos scenario. We just
Yeah.
don't know who the enemies are. There's like the four deities of like evil, and they're all somewhat different in different colors, but they're all working together somehow. And of course, it doesn't make sense to the layperson, which is why your show is important. I guess our show is important because we get to analyze this very complicated situation, which even reading Wikipedia will not assist like the average person. They will not know what the hell is happening here because it is confusing. And I mean, that's probably the part of the demonic factor of all of this is the fact that, well, nothing makes sense. It's incredibly incoherent. It's like speaking in tongues. It's literally that's the geopolitical outlook for today. It's just incoherent mumbo jumbo. And Ukraine is like the best example of that.
oh, absolutely. And I am thinking, while I hate to pull away from this conversation on Ukraine, looking at the time, we only have about half an hour left, in which case I want to get into a little bit about Armenia while we still have some time to spare.
hmm
And just the complete collapse of Artsakh and Pashinyan probably being uh, the worst traitor to his nation alive today, in my opinion, one of them. I think I know that's a very high bar to meet, but I think he's slowly climbing. Well, actually, very rapidly climbing to the top with the abolition of the Artsakh Republic. And this isn't going to be the end of it. I think everyone realizes that this is just the beginning when it comes to Azeri and by proxy Turkish interest in the region. And just a brief background, as I'm sure you all know, and as we've covered extensively, Artsakh, which was the Armenian enclave within Azerbaijan that had been there since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1992, they fought a brief war over it in 2020. And as tensions increased just a few months ago, there was an agreement reached, a quote unquote agreement reached, where Artsakh was disarmed and the Azeri authorities marched in and completely put an end to the autonomous, I believe autonomous region as they called it, within Azerbaijan. And as it stands now, Armenia is currently looking at about 40,000. I believe the figure was about 40,000 displaced who will be seeking to enter into Armenia. And as I said, Pashinyan time again has shown that he was not willing to defend his co-ethnics abroad when in a very clear situation where he certainly had the backing to. He had not only the Russians to call on, but certainly could have called them. I'm not even talking about some sort of military engagement. I'm just saying that theoretically, at least, Armenia had the it had a nice hand to play with the diplomatic maneuvers it could have made with the great powers, even including the the Western powers. We're not that they're the greatest of partners and allies, but still enough of a counterbalance when it comes to their ongoing feud with Turkey, where you could have at least played that beyond just calling it Macron and asking for help and appealing to some vague notions of human rights, democracy, etc., etc. And of course, the Iranians, who were also very willing to be supportive of this. But after a certain point, Pashinyan, of course, he was part of the Velvet Revolution, the Color Revolution government that came to power in 2018. He closed all avenues that any potential ally could have helped him with when he more or less conceded, saying that, yeah, Artax is part of Azeri territory. It's not Armenian. And he didn't press the issue at all. And I'm not even saying that he should have claimed it as Armenian, but once again, he did not press the issue, even in the slightest, and completely sacrificed that. And like I said, you could make the argument that, oh, of course, this is just an ethnic enclave in a bordering country, but I have a hard time believing, and I think anyone who has looked at the situation should have a hard time believing that this is really going to be the end of where this conflict is at. I mean, we all know the Turkish ambition in the region. We all know the hub of energy, quite literally, that Azerbaijan is. In which case, they've made themselves untouchable in that sense because who's going to disrupt the flow of the pipelines and disrupt this energy hub that they have right there in the Caucasus? It's very strategically placed in that regard where the Russians can't really touch it, the Europeans can't touch it, the Americans maybe they could use it as a throttle depending on how much they actually do want to manipulate the market with that and manipulate the. But once and look, we know how the Americans are with pipelines, judging by the war in Syria, judging by Nord Stream, etc. But
Mm.
they seemed keen in keeping the Azeris in their good graces because at this point it's looking like they are the alternative energy source for the Europeans, or at least one of them that's to supposedly get them away from quote unquote Russian energy dependence, which is just a pipe dream when it comes. No, once again, no pun intended. Just a pipe dream when it comes to Europe as a whole, because in terms of actual affordable, reasonable energy, it's the only options the Europeans have is Russia. Even when it comes to nuclear power, I mean, look at who has look at who has the uranium, especially with the situation in West Africa that happened a month and a half ago. Oh, once again, that's an avenue rapidly closing. But Azerbaijan simply made itself untouchable. Armenia stripped itself because of the absolute snake, the absolute traitor that is Nikol Pashinyan. Absolutely stripped itself of any diplomatic leverage it could have had in this conflict. Stripped itself of any bargaining power it had with the Azeris. I'm not saying that the Armenians could have won a war with the Azeris at this point, but this is a country once again for the past 5 years has rejected opportunity. Not only, and I'm not even saying that like the Russians or that the Russians should have sole rights over Armenia. Blah blah blah. Once again, people love to make those very disingenuous arguments. But point being is, even just completely pragmatically speaking, you have a major power that is a counterbalance to Turkey, which is a country that you certainly have a very bloody history with, just speaking as the Prime Minister of Armenia, the head of the Armenian government. And you have this country that's been fighting a proxy war against Turkey for the better part of a decade in Syria, especially when it comes to their drone warfare tactics, and you reject integrating air defenses with that country, you reject military operations and military cooperation, I should say, with that country, completely to your own detriment. And like I said, it doesn't even have to be out of some sense of like brother nations, Russia and Armenia. Just completely pragmatically speaking, this man has forsook his nation at every opportunity, both at home and abroad. And there's really no other words to put this. And the fact that he is still in power is, I want to know who has this guy under their protection, because the things that would have happened to, if this would have happened in a lot of other nations, this man would not be here today to get up and bloviate in front of the Armenian parliament and get up and bloviate in front of these foreign leaders when it comes to these negotiations. But and at this point, he has, speaking from his own bottom line, he's going to try to pass off. He's going to try to pass the buck on these displaced Armenians from Artsakh, because they are guaranteed, because of the situation that happened, not going to have a positive opinion towards Pashinyan. So he's going to try to. I don't know where he's going to try to pass the buck to, but he's not going to take responsibility for these people. He might leave them just out of his own complete self interest, might leave them stranded in a very hostile Azeri state. And I mean, of course, he doesn't care. He'll have the golden parachute. He'll get to do what Saakashvili did, and he'll get the NGOs, and maybe he'll even run for president of Ukraine, like Saakashvili wanted to as well. But I mean, he'll be set for life. He can go hang out with the Glendale diaspora. He can go to any of these areas, and he can start some NGO called the Armenian Foundation for Human Rights and Democracy, some NGO that they can launder all this money through, and like I said, make him a very wealthy and comfortable man, while his nation, once again, one of has one of the most storied history in the world, if you know anything about the Armenians, and has been through hell and high water. I can't think of any other way to put that. Is being subject to yet a what looks like at this point, if the current trajectory continues, barring some sort of major intervention from the outside, yet another century of statelessness for this people. And it once again, it didn't have to be this way. Armenia itself, post Soviet Union, was a rump state. I think we can all admit that. But that is still marginally preferable, given the circumstances, than the alternatives. But this man, in his actions, and like I said, maybe on the surface, maybe if you want to look at this, him letting down an ethnic enclave in a bordering country isn't that big of a deal, which once again, I disagree with. But even if you want to take that perspective, you have to look at all of this within context. The fact that this is simply part of a chain of larger events of what this man has done to this country, what this man has done in this region, to the point where I am extremely pessimistic about the future of the Armenians. And look, I'm not proclaiming the downfall of Armenia because I have some sort of grudge against the entire people or have some dislike of them. No, I have, from at least my limited interactions personally and with what I know about them, I have a pretty positive opinion of them. But I can't help but say my honest opinion here, and I think they're in, for lack of a better term, just completely screwed.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're again, for, I respect Armenia as one of the earliest Christian nation, maybe the first Christian civilization, you could even say, with their, ethno-linguistic, geographic, uniqueness and their persistence in the face of existential threats. But I hate to say it, but we're low-key seeing the death knells of any kind of Armenian civilization right now, if I've ever seen it, because I mean, it seems that, Azerbaijan, one of the main reasons they need to secure Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh is for eventually to secure basically the entire southern panhandle of Armenia, of course, to secure the Zangezur corridor and everything. And ultimately, I mean, we know Azerbaijan and Turkey, it's one nation, two states, right? That's what they say. But they also ultimately see, I mean, they already have the Nakhchivan exclave, and once they secure, those parts of Armenia, they can succeed in even, having a stronger foothold against their Kurdish enemies, and they can
Well,
ultimately
excuse me,
really
I actually
connect
forgot
infrastructure.
another major Turkic state. Actually, two other major Turkic states that are in play. I'll start with the first one. Kazakhstan, because of their lobbying efforts within the CSTO, made Artsakh not covered by the treaty and when it comes to attack. So there's that.
Mhm.
And also the other Turkic state, Israel, played a role in this, a major role
Mhm.
in this. And yeah, look, don't look, Ashkenazi, Turkic. It's just I'm not going to debate this with anyone. I'm sorry, but
Look, just listen to episode 17 of Ether Hour, everybody. Khazaria, we go there. So, just
but
I'm
once
just
again,
saying.
this is also uh, look. We're the only ones who can claim a 20th century genocide, goy. But this was a pivotal nation when it came to support for Azerbaijan for the better part of a decade now. Once again, and have completely sold them down the river. So of course as we know with the Zionist lobby in the U.S., I'm not going to rehash that because I think I can guarantee you, everyone listening to this program right now knows everything there is to know about that at this point. Look, it's just an afterthought at this point, honestly, when it comes to how much we've gotten into. But clearly, with the Zionist lobby in the U.S. now, while I do believe it is declining in power relative to other lobbies, it still has its strings to pull there, and I think we can very easily start to see why, between all of the different interests in Azerbaijan, why Armenia has been put in this terminal decline. Like I said, I take no pleasure in saying that, but that is I really hope I'm wrong, but as the situation looks now, I have to call it a terminal decline, at least from the information I'm working with.
Well, I mean, the way I look at the whole thing with Armenia is chronologically. There was a bit of a spat between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis in 2018. And a guy named Pashinyan was riding on his bicycle in Armenia and telling everybody about corruption. He was also sponsored by George
What a brave soul.
Soros. And what a brave soul. Like cycling through, like this whole, man of the people act. It's so ridiculous. Paid by one of the most rich individuals in the world. So this happens. Armenia is successful against Azerbaijan. He becomes president. He gets rid of his generals, and he knows the score. He knows what he has to do. He has Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh has to be given away. He has to find a way to give it away. He has other things that he has to do. And last week when we did the show, I said this whole thing is also about getting the Russian troops out of Nagorno-Karabakh and getting American troops in there. And of course, he called for this week, he wants French and US troops there,
Mhm.
right? Um, he wanted to lose this war, but he didn't want to pay the consequences. So he had to play this game with the Russians. And yet, his wife says that, Putin should go to to the Hague. Like completely crazy stuff, right? Like outrageous statements, outrageous statements.
Yeah,
And
I was just going to say the level of, I mean, Pashinyan, just the sheer, I mean, it seems to me, just to kind of tie this into what we like to talk about on our show a lot, it seems that he's being used as this, the Armenians are going to be this, poor, oppressed minority within the Turkish belt that's developing, from Istanbul all the way to
mhm.
Turkestan and China, if you think about it geographically. They're going to be in there to keep the Russians out. And eventually, I mean, look, we talk a lot about the shift towards eventual Russo-Turkish conflict. And if there's some kind of Turkish superstate in the center of Eurasia with the backing of, the US and NATO, then that's a big problem for Russia's southern flank in general. Unfortunately, though, it's not like I can really hold it against the Russians for not doing more. Like, what are you going to do? Support the Pashinyan regime? That would be
Yeah.
ridiculous. So, it's a bit of a bind they're in. But at the same time,
And Biden met with 5 members of the stands, including Kazakhstan this week.
mm,
So,
Yeah, we just spoke to Hrvoje Moric, who was a he taught at university at Nazarbayev's university in Kazakhstan. So be sure to tune into that episode. He talks about his time there, which is yeah, Kazakhstan is it's I mean, people forget that about the color revolution there right before the SMO went off. It's a very key part of this whole puzzle.
mhm,
I find it somewhat curious that there are arguments from history, say similar to the ones possibly Russians bring, like these contentions towards Moldova, Western Ukraine, where they say, well, this was ancient Russian land, and the Armenians are trying to do the same. Despite the fact that 7 million Armenians live abroad in the diaspora, and only 3 million Armenians actually live in Armenia today. Well, given historical genocides and things like that, right? Movements of peoples in the 20th century in general, and so let's just keep in mind that Armenia as a sort of nation does have these, I guess, mixed opinions based on where the people of the diaspora are based. So we spoke about
mhm,
Simanyan, the editor in chief of RT. So she's incredibly pro-Russian, and she believes Armenians should be pro-Russian. And then you have the Armenian lobby and I guess the diaspora in America who want to push Pashinyan towards a more Western, a more Western angle. But Pashinyan really, given his reign and given even the dominance of his political party in Armenia, has failed to become either more pro-Russian or even more pro-Western. If anything, he's moved at a very snail pace, comparatively to, say, even Georgia or even how pro-Israeli Azerbaijan is. Right? Not saying Israel is exactly the West, but Azerbaijan has made its sort of international diplomacy very quite clear. Meanwhile, Armenia has kind of just floated on the spot, not really moved anywhere. And even since the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, Armenia has begun actually woke up to the fact that look, it actually needs to choose a side, and that particular dilemma has only dawned on them quite recently. And that I did hear a few Russian analysts frankly even say that, well, why is, like Konstantin mentioned, how is Pashinyan still in power, right? Given that the fact that he's not just a loser, but there are alternatives internally. And possibly it's the fact that even the Russians want Pashinyan there, as strange as it may seem, but it may
mm,
be even beneficial for them to have this utter cuck in power who literally isn't like the West have used him with suspicion, right? Because he's just a guy from, I guess he didn't even go to a popular university. I guess he's a journalist by profession, which isn't looked at very fondly in Armenia itself. He's not a lawyer. He's not an
Nor should
economist.
it be looked at
He's just a
fondly anywhere.
journalist. Well, I mean, my good friend, quite a good journalist, right? So there are journalists who do good God's work.
Self-hating, self-hating.
Okay. But you know what I mean. Papashinyan is not really even a popular figure in Armenia. But why is he in power? And why have the Russians not completely ousted him yet? Even say through soft power means it's probably because I think there's a small chance, maybe under 10%, maybe even under 5%, that he actually benefits both the West and the Russians at the same time. I know this sounds strange, but possibly that could be he's just this, like, unlike having somebody like Saakashvili in Georgia, who's a little bit exuberant, who eats his own tie, who's really nervous, a little bit dramatic. Like, he really transformed Georgia into this weird NATO-esque state that we see today, right? So Saakashvili was a little bit out of control, similar to Zelensky in a way, where Zelensky goes to the UN and he basically says whatever's on his mind, and he's somewhat of a coke addict, which Saakashvili probably was too. But Pashinyan is a slow burn sort of degenerate alternative, which maybe is beneficial to Russia, who simply they don't know what to do with Armenia yet. They haven't even sorted out Georgia, and frankly, Chechnya and Dagestan are always they're trying to resolve these issues constantly, and they just don't have time for Armenia. So how about we just keep this placeholder party over there, and Pashinyan suits it quite perfectly. And look, the West doesn't necessarily like support him all the way either. So, there's a chance that Pashinyan will, in fact, remain in power until the next election, and he won't be ousted via Maidan. And if we don't see Pashinyan kicked out of office, I think that there's a potential that that scenario is, and this was really covert and of course speculative, because of course if the Russians did have a dossier and like a brief on Pashinyan, like look, he's our guy, but we're not going to tell anybody. It would be only known by the top elites in the Kremlin. So of course this will never sort of become public information. But I think there is a small percentage, if we speculate, small percentage chance that that is the reality, which is why Pashinyan is still around today, given the fact that he lost the first war, now he lost the second war. His country is in essentially diplomatic as well as moral ruin. And there's other small considerations in the Azerbaijan Armenia situation. For example, will the Armenian Apostolic Church open up a diocese in Baku now, given the fact that a lot of its people in Nagorno-Karabakh will need to travel to Baku for work as well as to maybe attend university. Will the Armenian Apostolic Orthodox Church, which they call themselves Orthodox, but we all know kind of that they're schismatic, so to speak, maybe even heretical, but that's kind of besides the fact. We're not going to go into theology here, but will the Armenian Apostolic Church, how will it react, right? How will the Catholicus of that particular church, their version of the Patriarch, will he speak, fondly of the Azerbaijanis? Will he, will the Armenian Orthodox Church expand for the first time in its history, beyond the borders of a diaspora abroad? I mean, lots of really interesting considerations, I think.
Well, you mentioned you've sent actually in the chat. We're looking at some of those pictures of signs in Ukraine praising the retaking of Artsakh by Azerbaijan, and of course there's that kind of precedent that all these countries have. The like it's the reason why Spain is such an ally of Serbia, right? They have their problem with the Catalan separatists, so therefore they back up the president of Serbia not recognizing Kosovo because of an EU principle of European principle of not supporting separatists, and therefore in theory Russia could support Armenia in their fight against Azerbaijan for Artsakh because it's analogous to the situation going on in Donbass and Ukraine. And the at the same time, though, I mean, because of that, I believe Lavrov, kind of had to address this at the General Assembly. He said that the European Union is currently imposing its mediation service on Azerbaijan and Armenia, which is causing destabilization in the South Caucasus region in partnership with the United States. And I agree with GSP, who's been on this right on this on the dot that Pashinyan ultimately wants U.S. Western troops in the region. But this is just rumor, and I've been fooled by Armenian propaganda before, so I don't put it past those guys. But I do have to ask. I mean, I've seen reports on multiple Telegram channels. Supposedly, the Russian peacekeepers in the region that were killed because they stumbled upon war crimes being perpetrated by the Azeris. Is there any? Do you think that's what maybe went down?
Oh, I did not know that. Wow. But I'm not surprised.
Yeah, and again, like
Anyone else's
speaking of the
thoughts?
peacekeepers, speaking of the peacekeepers who died, right? There is, of course, Ivan Kovgun, the captain of, he's an officer of the peacekeeping force in Armenia in the Nagorno-Karabakh. He was killed, and he was, a devout Orthodox Christian. There's photographs and videos of him attending Orthodox churches in Russia, and now he was one of the proclaimed, I guess, a unit of collateral damage, you could say, right, of the Russian Federation, who has passed away, and probably he'll be, not to sound negative, but he may be put into the same bucket as the pilots and the Air Force personnel who were killed during the Prigozhin coup attempt on the 24th of June. So it's like, well, there'll be a week of mourning, and then he'll be completely forgotten for the rest of history, right? Which is not to say that the Russians should be somehow addressing or getting involved, but there should be some mention of the fact that, look, it seems like Russian officers and Russian troops are dying throughout geopolitical conflict outside of Ukraine under very mysterious circumstances, and it is collateral damage, you can say. Or, I mean, will it ever be investigated, or do we have to, does the Russian, I guess, movie industry need to film like TV shows like True Detective to investigate this stuff in the future? Like, I'm not sure. Well, like, who exactly will shed light on why these Russian peacekeepers have died on the borders of Armenia, Azerbaijan? Will we have any answers? Because these people were Orthodox, unlike the majority of the Azeri military or the Armenians who are defending Nagorno-Karabakh, which there wasn't really much shooting going on anyway. So it's I think it's in our interest to kind of have this kind of disclosed to us, but I'm just not sure if we're going to have this information become public, which is concerning. But hey, it's kind of our duty as podcasters, as geopolitical analysts, as analyzers of the political and of mainstream media narratives, to kind of shed light on the fact that these things are not being spoken about.
Yeah, the report I read, it was, of course, again, both sides of this. I mean, of course, I've seen some pretty brutal stuff from the Azeri side in the past, so it's not like I put it past them, but it was, a pretty brutal account of, coming upon, civilians being, slaughtered and abused and whatnot, and the Russians seeing what was going on, and then, the Azeris, making sure they didn't escape to report back to their superiors. But yeah, I mean, it's, the Lashin corridor had been closed down for a very long time at this point, intermittently, so the people there had been getting very used to the isolation. And it seems now that they're committed to supposedly integrating the Armenians. They don't want to, do a Turkish-Greek style population exchange, I guess, or anything like that. So I guess, the those kinds of things, the West doesn't like that when they like to pretend that, like race and ethno and religious differences don't exist. They don't like to, bring that stuff to the forefront, I guess. But I think it's yeah, I mean it's just a terrible situation all around, just another tragedy of the fall of the Soviet Union, which again, not that anyone here is a defender of the Soviet Union. We've dedicated hours and hours of time on the mic to crapping on the MAGA communist crowd, but it just shows that these wounds run deep, and
Yeah, you
decades
can't
of
have a
communism was not going to
two-dimensional view
stop.
of these things.
Yeah, decades of communism was not going to stop Muslims and Christians in the Caucasus from having problems with each other.
Actually, quite the
Hmm.
opposite. You look at the ethnic gerrymandering that participated in, and I mean that's really I don't know if he'd really consider the Caucasus Europe, but just for the sake of the statement here, every ethnic conflict in Europe post 1945 has been the result of ethnic gerrymandering these by the Soviet state and of course the Yugoslav state as well when it comes to that. But I mean, what you guys said, like I said, I couldn't have summed up better myself when it comes to the question of Armenia, which I like I said, I there's not really much I can add to it.
I mean, ultimately, what's I think preventing what ultimately what's preventing Armenia becoming that which, let's say, America would like it to become is Turkey and Azerbaijan, because paradoxically, well, paradoxically, Turkey and Azerbaijan don't want Armenia in NATO. Um, but I think the possibility of America, and maybe according to Pashinyan, with his words, even the French having some kind of a forward base there would be advantageous for them, even if nothing more than to keep an eye on Georgia, spy on Russia, make their presence felt there. We should remember that the EU opened an office the day before um, Azerbaijan resumed its attacks on Nagorno-Karabakh. So uh, ultimately, there would have to be some kind of let's say, a compromise. But I do think the Americans want to be there. There's not much they can do being there, but I think what is available for them is enough. And if it doesn't, if they don't get Armenia in, because of course Pashinyan is doing this for them. That's why he's doing this, because he's working on the presumption that America is going to give them access to the
Hmm.
EU and NATO and so on and so on. That's why all of this has happened in the first place. And I mean, if they had wanted to strengthen their ties with Russia after successfully pushing back the Azerbaijanis in 2018, because 2020 was a disaster, they could have, right? But again, Pashinyan got in. But you guys might
What
have
kind of
a different take.
Well, I mean, I'm sure we can all order our Armenia NATO Gunter Fellinger pins for us all to sport around
Oh,
Oh no.
as we walk around our favorite European countries to try to
a
court
real
them into
blessing.
NATO. But I know Dimitri has to head out soon. I can stick around for a little bit longer, but I want
Hmm.
to give him the chance to say any last words on these issues we've discussed.
Oh yeah, go ahead. I think
If
we'll actually just wrap up with that because I am reaching my time constraint as well, unfortunately, as much as I'd love to continue this discussion. And hopefully we can arrange something in the near future in order to do
mhm.
so. But yeah, the floor is all yours.
All good. No, it's been a pleasure. I suppose I'll make a few predictions because we love doing that, especially given the fact that the future is really we've seen all kinds of weird stuff happen, and we do consume a lot of information. So I think we have the leeway and permission to make these sort of, but predictions for the future. But let's just say, Nagorno-Karabakh, this region of Artsakh, now it's a member of Azerbaijan, a large portion of the population is still probably considers themselves Armenian ethnically. And what we've seen in the Middle East, given in Syria, in whether it be even in Lebanon itself, the Lebanese civil war, 15 years between 1975 and 1990, really intense. The country was incredibly divided, even within itself, right, among religious and tribal lines. And of course, Israel between the Palestinians and Israelis, we've seen Gaza, the West Bank conflict ensues internally. So what we may see in Nagorno Karabakh would be, of course, the local Armenians rising up against their Azeri overlords, and we'll have and this may take a few months and a few years when the local, I guess you could say, even passionate and pasionarne, as we'd say in Russia, like these really enthusiastic Armenian nationalists would probably rise up and begin, causing trouble, right, for the local authorities, and we may even see terrorist acts of some sort. I'm not sure how much precedent there is for that in Armenian culture, but we have seen the Kurds, act against the Syrian government in the past, for better or for worse. And we have seen movements. That is the trend in the Middle East, is when you're not happy with something, you rise up against those who are so allegedly oppressing you. So we may be seeing that, and the ball
Fed
in many
posting
ways
culture.
is in the court of the Armenians. Yeah,
Mm.
the ball is in the Armenian court. So now Azerbaijan has established peace, and now they're going to start rebuilding Nagorno-Karabakh and integrating it and building highways, hospitals, rearranging the school system, perhaps opening up university and sort of tenureship for teachers out of Nagorno-Karabakh and Artsakh. So we have to consider what will the Armenian reaction be, and I think the ball is very much in their court. How will the Armenian people in that particular region react? Will they be violent? Will they be servile in the best of ways? So I think that's kind of where my analysis needs to stop because, well, we'll have to see. And this news is only 1 week old, so it's incredibly fresh and I want to say very mysterious, but I guess we'll see, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can give my final take on
Oh,
everything.
certainly.
I think at the end of the day, this is, the arc of history continues to shift towards, as we predicted, of course, there's the multipolar dispute that could get hot across multiple fronts. Of course, East Asia being the one that is on the precipice, being at peace almost entirely, but could go hot in the next 5 years. And I think, we have our show World War now because we think we're in those early stages of that World War. And, people might not think Armenia, Azerbaijan is the most relevant thing. When you think of its connection to the empires right on its periphery, of course you have to talk about it. I mean, it's this crossroads of empires that's where these things, just like, World War One, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand at the, where the Serbs and the Austro-Hungarians had their disputes. I mean, it's these same kind of disputes, the same language of history being repeated again, and we have to, I think, remaining vigilant is prudent at these times. And of course, we're watching Russia Ukraine very closely with this Crimea stuff. It never seems to be, well, like we said, like there's always another red line that gets crossed, and we're kind of waiting. Is this Russian response going to be appropriate to what we've seen them get pushed on? And that's kind of tell the tale. I think in February on this 2 year anniversary, like I said, Dimitri made some predictions. I think come February 2024, we're going to kind of know how serious Russia is actually about, like, are they willing to take Ukraine up to the Dnieper? Are they willing to go beyond that? Are they willing to, completely overthrow a regime if need be? I don't have an answer to that question yet, but I think we're going to see it answered sooner rather than later.
Mhm.
Oh, of course. And just the closing thoughts I'll give is, like I said, there's very little I can actually add on to what you said because once again you had put it so concisely. But I find myself saying this all the time on the show. It's really something we'll just have to wait and see, let the dust settle. But I genuinely do fear things are going to get worse, and that this is going to be something. This entire global situation is going to be something that does escalate and is going to cost millions of lives, destroy the livelihoods of many millions more, and it's like I said, I don't try to exaggerate. I don't try to play this kind of stuff up for the cameras, the audience, whatever. But it's becoming a very frightening situation, just all around. And uh, whenever you think there's a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, it does seem that something else just comes up, and that we're staring down the barrel of something far worse. Now, like I said, as with most of my predictions on the show, I do genuinely hope I am wrong, but I, it comes down to the point where these things that we discuss week to week or every few weeks, depending on when we actually do end up getting the episodes out, are things that, in order to fully understand them, you have to put together over years, decades, sometimes even centuries in some cases. But and that's what I really try to do: cover what's happening while trying to connect it to what has previously happened, trying to really string it all together so we get a big picture idea of the current situation. And just looking at it, I do think that we are heading towards an era of just complete global instability, something that we haven't seen at least in, I would say, actually about 120 years. I'm talking even pre World War One. And I like I think you guys are on some of the premise that, well, when everything is said and done, when this is looked back upon, will they consider this the start of another world war, another major conflict? And like I said, I wouldn't say either way as of the moment, but I do think that with that you actually are onto something with that, which I will once again give you guys a lot of credit for. And once again, thank you to both. I know Dimitri had to dip out a little early to coming on. And if you have any final thoughts, or if GSP you have any final thoughts, certainly. But if not, I can go ahead and bring it to a close.
I just want to say I'm
Um,
just repeating the words of Metropolitan Theophilus of Morphu, right? He called all of this before I ever could. He predicted the COVID nonsense, weeks before any countries locked down. He said we're living in the last normal week of the world. And then right at the beginning of weeks before the special military operation, he's saying we're actually
wow,
living in the second year of the Third World War. So, I encourage people, if they're going to do anything, check out him. He's in Cyprus. He has some great stuff out there. But I
amazing.
guess worldwarnow.substack.com. I'm at gnomerad on Twitter. World War Now Telly on Telegram. That's it for me. Thank you so much, guys. It's been an honor. I'm a big
Thank you
fan.
for
So
coming.
Well,
To the both of you.
thank you once again, and thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode of the War Report. We'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care. God